You've had this extraordinary career. You started as a journalist, you wrote novels, you've written plays. Have you ever had a sense that you always wanted to do all of that?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but I was extremely unclear what writing was going to involve. And I certainly didn't always want to write plays. I had a terrible failure with a show when I was a student and turned against the theatre. And for many, many years, actually
you wrote about it quite dyspeptically in
print.
Well,
I used to write a column in the Guardian and the Observer. And a lot of those columns were mocking the theatre and saying you were just waiting for actors to forget their lines or drop their props, and how embarrassing it was going to the theatre. Well, no. Of course, with hindsight, we literary critics can see, historians of literature can see that this was all leading up to Noises Off. But at the time, it wasn't. I just despised the theatre.
It's almost exactly 30 years since Noises Off first premiered. It's one of the most revived comedies of all time, certainly most recently. Do you ever get bored of it?
Do I ever get bored of it? Well, I don't see it all that often. I couldn't conceivably go and see all the productions of it. I got rather bored of the original production because it ran for 5 years. We had to keep going and see a new cast. And with this production, we haven't done much rewriting. But Lindsay Posner, who's done an absolutely wonderful production of it, is very scholarly. And all through the rehearsal period, he kept phoning up to say, I can't quite make sense of this stage direction. And he seems to exit into the linen cupboard and emerge from the bathroom. And I'd realised that over the course of the years, all the rewrites, various errors have crept in, which have never been taken out. And I sometimes think that in productions elsewhere in the world that I haven't seen, that I haven't talked to the director about, people have been faithfully exiting into the linen cupboard and coming out of the bathroom absolutely incomprehensibly a few lines later.
Thinking they're following the author's intentions, there must be a deep significance in exiting in the wrong way.
And the director explaining to the cast that this was English humour.
I guess we should explain for people who haven't seen it. It's a play about things going wrong. It's a play within a play, but it's all about a comedy falling apart and pretty much everything goes wrong that can go wrong.
But the play they're doing, I should explain, is a pastiche of an English sex farce, a very crummy English sex farce. And people said, well, it wouldn't work anywhere else because people haven't seen English sex farces. Well, this proves not to be the case. It seems to work anywhere.
As a writer, if you're writing a novel, say, all you have to do is make one reader laugh. Whereas if you're trying to make a room full of people laugh, you won't actually know whether it's a success until you put it in front of an audience. So you could write what you think is the funniest script in the world, put it in front of an audience, and then no one laughs. And yes. I mean, has that been something that's worried you ever?
Oh yes, when I've written comedies that have gone in front of an audience and they haven't laughed, yes, I'm extremely worried. And I've certainly written comedies that haven't worked. I was going to say, you said I've written different sorts of comedy. I've written two different sorts of comedy. I've written comedies that have made people laugh and comedies that haven't made people laugh. And I don't recommend doing the second sort at all.
I mean, people might not know that there's a kind of successor to Noises Off called Look, Look, which was a flop, wasn't it? I mean,
absolute catastrophe. Yeah. I think they probably do know by now because I've talked about it so many times. But it was one of those weird things. We thought when we had it in the rehearsal room that we had a success. And the producer, very experienced producer, Michael Frayn, came to see it at the run-through in the rehearsal room and said it's very, very funny indeed. And then we got in front of the first audience for the first preview and we all knew it was a corpse. And we all knew that I would go on working on that corpse for every day of the previews, rewriting, and the cast would go on learning complete new scenes. And we all knew it was going to end up as a corpse. So you start with a corpse, you end up with a corpse.
Another strand of your theatre work is translation. You've translated pretty much all of Chekhov's major works. Usually when writers work as translators in the theatre, they don't speak the language. They tend to be operating from literal translations, which they then sort of tart up. You actually do speak Russian. You learn Russian.
Yes, well, I would find it, it's hard enough translating a Russian play out of Russian. Translating a Russian play out of somebody else's literal translation seems to me just impossible. I mean, that's how I got into it, because the National Theatre, before I'd done any translation, the National Theatre asked me to translate some Goldoni. And I said, well, you know, only got tourist Italian, I really can't do it. They say, oh, God, you don't need to speak
Don't
Italian.
need to speak Italian, no.
Goldoni. We just go out and buy some standard, translate some standard Goldoni text, English Goldoni text, and you hash them together to make your own text. So I certainly said I'd have a go, and we got some standard texts, and I took them home and I read through them, and I could not feel what the original was like. It was like trying to do some sort of surgical operation with thick woolen gloves, and I just couldn't feel what the original was like. And I said, well, I simply can't. Why don't you ask me to translate out of a language I can actually read, Russian? And they were very amused by this idea. It was a very striking new idea. That's how I got to start translating Russian.
And what is it about Chekhov in particular? Because I suppose it strikes me that he's also a writer who is a comic writer, but there is this tragic weft and warp through all of the work. I mean, there's a lot of balance, there's sort of scepticism, there's a distance, there's an irony. All of those are qualities that are in your own work.
Yes, well, I think the first great attraction about Chekhov is he's an extremely good playwright, extremely good writer, I should say, because his stories are as good as his plays. And I think you're right that he is fundamentally a comic writer who began as a purely comic writer, writing comic sketches and skits and things, and he only very slowly developed into a serious writer. And his first success in the theatre, when he was already a serious writer for literary journals, his first success in the theatre was with boulevard comedies. I think the great thing about Chekhov, one of the great things about Chekhov, is that there is no trace of Chekhov in the works of Chekhov. You can search those plays and the stories, and nowhere will you come across anyone speaking in Anton Chekhov's voice. He is absolutely, totally absent. And it's not because he was a colourless person in life. He was a strikingly involved person with a lot of friends, leading a rather colourful, slightly loose life, in fact, but he doesn't put himself into his own works. And I think there's something extremely admirable about that modesty.
You started at the Manchester Guardian, you then moved on to the Observer. But both of those experiences, I guess, fed into your novel, which is Towards the End of the Morning. Perhaps a little bit like Noises Off, it exists and creates a world, but then mocks it and is sort of distant from it as well. I mean, does it reflect your own anxieties about journalism? And pretty much everyone in the book is trying to get out of journalism, apart from the one character who then dies and no one notices.
Right. And people say, it's based on our own experience. Some people say that's the Guardian, isn't it? Other people say that's the Observer. Well, as far as I can see, it's neither. It's a fictitious paper. No one ever believes that writers of fiction don't tell the truth about things. They think writing fiction is just a cover for writing about real people and real things. But I have to say that most of the writers of fiction I know do actually sometimes make things up. And I borrow characteristics from people, certainly. And the central character in Towards the End of the Morning was a colleague of mine on the Observer. Well, I borrowed a few characteristics from a colleague of mine on the Observer. No secret, because it's been written about since. But my character is called John Dyson, and the person whose characteristics I had leaned upon a bit was called John Silverlight. He was a leader page editor. He used to handle my copy, and I was extremely fond of him. And one of the things about John Silverlight, like the character in the book, is he never keep anything to himself. Whatever thought came into his head, he would come bursting out with it. So I knew that sooner or later he was going to read the book and recognise himself and ask me about it. And he was going to be indignant or pleased or whatever. Every week I would take my copy in, and John didn't say anything about it at all. 10 years went by, and I had something I'd written to the guy and took it in. We went out for a drink, and as we were walking back to the office, he suddenly said, "Michael, I know something I've been meaning to ask you." He said, "Somebody told me that you had based a character on me." He said, "But I saw that play and the character wasn't anything like me at all." You've got the wrong character after 10 years.
You've written a new novel, it's coming out later this year. It's an attempt to do farce on the page.
Yeah, experiment to see whether it's possible, because in the theatre you depend very heavily in farce on this group reaction, the heightened reaction you get from from a corporate audience. And it enables you to get away with outrageous things. And whether that's possible on the page, I don't know. We'll find out.
Michael Frayn, thank you very much.
Thank you.